April 27, 1953. Three men climbed into the cab of Big Boy number 4005. None of them would leave it alive. Big Boy locomotives were the largest steam engines ever built in America. 25 of these mechanical giants rolled out of the American Locomotive Company between 1941 and 1944, built exclusively for Union Pacific Railroad. Each one measured 132 feet in length. Each one weighed 1.2 million pounds fully loaded. Each one represented the absolute peak of steam locomotive engineering. On that spring morning in Wyoming, one of these massive machines was about to become something else entirely: a coffin. The assignment started like any other. Engineer Leo Murray, 42 years old, had worked for Union Pacific for 20 years. He knew every mile of track between Rawlins and Green River. His fireman, Lawrence Endress, was 23. Everyone called him Ed. He'd served 2 years in the Korean War with the Army's Railroad Division and came home to build his railroad career. He'd come in early that morning, around 3 a.m., wanting to familiarize himself again with the big boys after his time away. Head end brakeman James R. Anderton, 36 years old, rounded out the cab crew. A World War II veteran, Anderton had a wife and 2 children waiting at home. Behind them, in the caboose far back in the consist, rode conductor James Walker and rear brakeman Ivan Shurigar. The weather was cloudy with light mist. The locomotive, Big Boy 4005, was in excellent mechanical condition. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. Big Boy 4005 had history. Built in November 1941, it was part of the first production run of these articulated giants. The wheel arrangement was classified as 4-8-8-4. 4 leading wheels up front, 8 driving wheels on the front engine, 8 more driving wheels on the rear engine, 4 trailing wheels at the back. That articulated design, with a flexible joint between the front and rear engine sections, allowed these enormous machines to negotiate curves despite their massive length. The engineering was brilliant. The front engine and rear engine could move independently, each with its own set of cylinders and driving wheels. This gave the Big Boy flexibility that a rigid-frame locomotive of similar size could never achieve. The power these machines generated was staggering. At the driving wheels, a Big Boy produced 135,375 pounds of tractive effort at starting. At speed, they generated over 6,000 horsepower. The boiler operated at 300 pounds per square inch of steam pressure. The firebox consumed coal at a rate that required a mechanical stoker to feed it continuously. The tender carried 28 tons of coal and 24,000 gallons of water. When working hard hauling freight over Wyoming's grades, a Big Boy could burn through its entire coal capacity in a single shift. These locomotives were designed for one purpose: haul 3,600-ton freight trains over the Wasatch Mountains between Ogden, Utah, and Green River, Wyoming, without assistance. No helper engines, no stops for additional power, just pure, overwhelming mechanical force. That morning, Big Boy 4005 was assigned Freight Extra 4005 West, 62 cars and a caboose. The young callboy, Jim Dover, only 16 years old, had tracked down the crew in the early morning hours, running through Rawlins hunting pool houses and bars to notify them of their assignment. He'd stood talking with Ed Endress while they waited for the engineer. When the locomotive thundered past the dispatch office heading to the west end of the yard, Dover waved. The cement floor shook, the windows rattled. Then the Big Boy was gone, disappearing into the Wyoming darkness with its 3-man cab crew. At 9:10 a.m., the train passed through Wamsutter, Wyoming, headed westbound. The 0.43% descending grade made for easy travel. Murray had the throttle set. Endress was monitoring the boiler. Anderton rode in the cab. Behind them, 62 freight cars rolled smoothly along the rails. 10 minutes. That's all they had left. 10 minutes. 8.5 miles west of Wamsutter, at a place called Red Desert, another event was unfolding. A section gang from Fruin had traveled 3.6 miles east to Red Desert on a track motor car. They needed to obtain a supply of switch ties. 5 men, a foreman named Kenneth M. Mayfield, and 4 section workers. When they arrived, a sheep herder approached them. He needed help getting his flock across the tracks. Hundreds of sheep, maybe over 1,000. The foreman called for a track lineup. 4 trains were scheduled through Red Desert that morning. Westbound Extra 4005 West at 9:15 a.m., westbound Extra 1480 West at 9:50 a.m., eastbound Extra 3969 East at 9:15 a.m., eastbound Extra 1470 East at 9:55 a.m. The foreman made a decision. They would help the sheep herder. For safety, he assigned one section man to proceed eastward, another westward, to provide flag protection at each end of the siding. After one eastbound and one westbound train passed, they would clear the tracks for the sheep. As added protection, 2 other section men were ordered to open switches in the main track leading to the siding. This would display a block signal down the track in each direction, warning any approaching trains to slow down. The foreman unlocked both switches. He instructed the section men to open the switches on his hand signal. Then he walked back to the sheep herder some 300 yards from the switch to explain the plan. One of those section workers was Ralph Vicente, Puerto Rican. He spoke almost no English. He'd been working for Union Pacific for exactly 1 hour and 20 minutes. The foreman gave the signal. The switches were opened. The main track now diverted into the siding. Any train approaching from either direction would be routed off the main line. The section men took their positions. Vicente stood near the west switch, another worker near the east switch. 2 more men positioned themselves with flags down the track in each direction. The block signals displayed red. Everything was according to procedure. Everything was safe, except for one problem. The foreman forgot about the timing. At 9:20 a.m., Big Boy 4005 came around a curve doing 40 miles per hour. Some accounts say 50. Either way, the momentum was immense. 600 tons of locomotive, 400 tons of tender, 62 loaded freight cars, over 3,000 tons total, moving at speed across the open prairie. Mui saw the block signal, red. He saw the flagman ahead waving frantically. He saw the open switch. There was no time. At that speed, with that weight, the braking distance required was measured in thousands of feet. Murray had maybe 500 feet. He slammed the brakes into emergency. The wheels locked. Steel screamed against steel. Brake shoes bit down on wheel rims. But physics doesn't negotiate. Big Boy 4005 hit the diverging switch at 40 miles per hour. The front wheels followed the switch rails toward the siding. The rest of the locomotive could not. The massive machine twisted. The articulated joint between the front and rear engine sections, designed for flexibility on curves, was now being forced in a direction no engineer had ever intended. The frame bent, the wheels lifted. 600 tons of steel left the rails. It happened in seconds. The Big Boy rolled onto its right side, sliding, grinding, tearing up ties and ballast. The cab crushed inward. The tender, still moving at full speed, slammed into the back of the overturning locomotive with catastrophic force. Metal screamed. The boiler, still under 300 pounds of pressure, ruptured. Live steam vented in a roaring white column that shot 150 feet into the air. The sound was deafening, a shriek that could be heard for miles across the empty desert. The first 18 freight cars followed the locomotive off the rails. The first 12 cars piled up in a tangled heap 75 feet high. Cars 13 through 18 derailed, but remained relatively intact. Behind them, the rest of the train ground to a halt. Air brakes screaming, slack running out through the consist with a series of thunderous impacts. The cargo scattered across the Wyoming prairie. Farm tractors, typewriters, sewing machines, household goods, mail sacks, freight that should have reached Green River now lay strewn across hundreds of yards of desert. But nobody cared about cargo. The cab crew. Where was the cab crew?
The section workers ran toward the wreckage. The foreman, Mayfield, reached the scene first. What he saw would haunt him forever. The massive Big Boy lay on its right side. The cab was crushed flat. Twisted metal, shattered glass, and steam. Endless, scalding steam venting from ruptured lines. The roar made communication impossible. The heat made approach impossible. Through breaks in the steam clouds, they could see movement inside the wreckage. They could hear sounds, but they couldn't get close. Superheated steam, hot enough to strip flesh from bone in seconds, created a lethal barrier around the overturned locomotive. Word spread fast in 1953. Within an hour, workers from Wamsutter and Rollins arrived. The yardmaster dispatched the wrecker crane. The section superintendent arrived. The train master arrived. Division officials arrived. Everyone stood helpless, watching steam vent from the dying locomotive, knowing men were trapped inside, knowing there was nothing they could do but wait for the pressure to drop. Early reports claimed workers had talked to Murray and Endress. Hope briefly flickered. The newspapers would later report conversations through the wreckage, but this was tragically false. In the chaos and deafening roar of venting steam, workers on opposite sides of the toppled locomotive had been calling to each other, coordinating rescue efforts. In the confusion, someone thought those voices were coming from inside the cab. The hope lasted hours. The truth was worse. When the steam finally cleared enough to approach, when the metal had cooled enough to touch, when workers with cutting torches and pry bars finally reached the cab, they found Leo Murray and Lawrence Endress. Both had died instantly. The impact had crushed the cab. The tender, that 400,000-pound steel tank of water and coal, had slammed into the back of the overturning locomotive and obliterated the crew space. There had been no survival, no final words, no slow death, just the terrible mathematics of mass and velocity. 600 tons meeting immovable earth. The human body doesn't survive those calculations. But James Anderton was still alive. Somehow. The brakeman had been thrown forward in the impact, pinned in twisted wreckage in a position that had partially protected him from the initial crush. But that protection had become a prison. Metal beams pinned his legs. The boiler, still radiating heat, was inches from his body. Venting steam had scalded exposed skin, and there was no quick way to extract him. The position of the wreckage, the weight pressing down, the way metal had folded around him made rescue agonizingly complex. They worked for hours. Cutting torches carved through steel. Hydraulic jacks lifted impossible weight. Workers crawled into spaces barely wide enough for a human body, working by feel, in darkness, breathing air thick with coal dust and the smell of burnt metal. They administered morphine for the pain. They talked to Anderton, keeping him conscious, keeping him fighting. But the extraction took too long. The injuries were too severe. Burns covered 80% of his body. Internal injuries from the impact, exposure, shock. James R. Anderton held on for 2 days. 2 days of agony, 2 days of rescue workers fighting metal and physics. On April 29th, in the late morning, he died. The official cause was listed as burns and injuries sustained in the wreck. The real cause was simpler. A switch left open, a signal ignored, 10 seconds of wrong decisions that killed 3 men. The investigation was swift and conclusive. The Interstate Commerce Commission sent inspectors. Union Pacific conducted its own inquiry. The findings were identical. The switch at Red Desert had been left open. Big Boy 4005 had approached at 40 miles per hour. At that speed, with that weight, derailment was inevitable. The locomotive had performed exactly as designed. Its massive strength, its carefully calculated engineering, none of it mattered when the rails beneath it suddenly diverged in 2 directions. There was no mechanical failure, no design flaw, no defect in the legendary Big Boy. Just human error. Just a switch left open, and 3 men dead because of it. The section foreman, Kenneth Mayfield, had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He'd opened the switches to protect the sheep herder, to display warning signals down the line. But he'd forgotten about the scheduled trains. Big Boy 4005 was due through Red Desert at 9:15 a.m. It arrived 5 minutes late at 9:20. Those 5 minutes meant nothing to the schedule, but they meant everything to Murray, Endress, and Anderton. If the train had been on time, it might have passed before the switches were opened. If it had been 10 minutes late, the switches might have been closed again. 5 minutes, the margin between routine and tragedy. Ralph Vicente, the Puerto Rican section worker who spoke almost no English, wasn't blamed. He'd followed orders. He'd opened the switch when signaled. He'd been on the job for barely over an hour. The responsibility fell on the foreman, on the procedure, on the series of decisions that put an open switch in the path of a 600-ton locomotive moving at speed.
The cleanup took days. The wrecker crane arrived from Rollins. Track crews swarmed the site. Priority 1 was clearing enough wreckage to build a shoe fly, a temporary track around the accident site. Rail traffic couldn't stop. Even tragedy couldn't stop the railroad. Within 24 hours, trains were being routed around the wreckage. Within 3 days, the main line was operational again. But Big Boy 4005 still lay on its side in the Wyoming desert, a monument to what happens when procedures fail. Lifting the locomotive was a monumental task. The wrecker crane, one of the largest rail-mounted cranes Union Pacific owned, took days to position. Cables as thick as a man's arm were threaded under the massive frame. The boiler had to be drained, the firebox had to be cleared, systems had to be depressurized. When they finally lifted Big Boy 4005 upright, the damage was staggering. The right side, which had hit the ground, was crushed and scraped. Paint was ground away, metal was bent. The cab was destroyed. Several of the connecting rods, those massive steel arms that translated piston motion into wheel rotation, were bent beyond repair. They had to be cut away before the locomotive could be moved. Workers cut away parts of the frame that controlled lateral movement of the trailing truck. This allowed the damaged locomotive to negotiate curves during the tow. On May 2nd, 5 days after the wreck, Big Boy 4005 was hauled to Cheyenne, not under its own power, dead in tow behind another locomotive, a ghost, a corpse on wheels. At the Cheyenne shops, one of the most extensive locomotive repair facilities in the nation, Big Boy 4005 was rebuilt. Rebuilt. The word appeared again and again in Union Pacific documents. Rebuilt. New metal replaced twisted steel. The cab was reconstructed from scratch. The boiler was inspected, tested, certified. New connecting rods were fabricated and installed. Systems were reassembled. Piping was replaced. The mechanical stoker was overhauled. Every bearing was checked. Every valve was tested. Within months, Big Boy 4005 was returned to service. Returned, as if nothing had happened, as if 3 men hadn't died inside its cab. But the locomotive remembered. The scars remained even after repair. The right side of locomotive 4005 bore the marks of that April day. Dents, irregularities in the metal, panels that didn't quite match. Physical evidence of the day it became a killer. Railroad workers knew. Engineers who drew Big Boy 4005 for their assignments knew. That's the one, they'd say. That's the one that rolled at Red Desert. The locomotive continued in service for 6 more years. It hauled freight over Sherman Hill. It pulled tonnage across Wyoming's high plains. It did the work it was built to do. 6 years. But it never forgot. In 1959, along with the rest of Union Pacific's Big Boy fleet, Big Boy 4005 was retired. Diesel locomotives had taken over the railroad's heavy freight duties. The age of steam was ending. The big boys, those magnificent giants that had ruled the mountain grades for nearly 2 decades, were being systematically retired and scrapped. On July 21, 1959, the last revenue freight train hauled by a big boy ended its run. By 1962, the last big boys in operational condition were finally retired. The era of the giant steam locomotives was over. Big Boy 4005 was initially prepared for shipment to Argentina. The South American railroads still used steam power. They wanted the massive locomotives. The locomotive was partially dismantled, prepared for the ocean voyage. But the Argentine buyers couldn't raise enough money to complete the purchase. So Big Boy 4005 stayed in the United States. For years it sat in storage, one of the few big boys to escape the scrapper's torch. In June 1970, the locomotive was donated to the Forney Museum of Transportation in Denver, Colorado. It was moved to the museum, reassembled for static display, and placed where visitors could walk around it, touch it, photograph it. Walk up to Big Boy 4005 today at the Forney Museum and look at its right side. The scars are still there. 72 years after Red Desert, the metal still remembers. The panels don't quite line up. The paint doesn't quite match. If you know where to look, You can see where new steel was welded to old. You can trace the path of impact, the way the locomotive twisted and fell, written in permanent deformation of metal. On April 26, 2003, 50 years after the accident, the Forney Museum held a memorial. Families of the crew attended. 2 engineers who had operated Big Boy 4005 in its working days came to remember. They held Big Boy Day. Railroad songs, stories, cab tours of the locomotive, readings about the disaster. Children made crafts while adults remembered 3 men who went to work one April morning and never came home. Leo Murray left behind a family. 42 years old, 20 years with Union Pacific, gone in an instant. Lawrence Andrus, everyone called him Ed, had survived the Korean War. He'd served his country in the Army's Railroad Division, come home, and was building his future with Union Pacific. 23 years old, a lifetime ahead of him, erased in the second it took for 600 tons of steel to leave the rails. James R. Anderton suffered for 2 days. World War II veteran, husband, father of 2, 36 years old. 2 days of agony before death released him. Their names are not on the locomotive. There is no plaque at Red Desert. The site of the wreck is unmarked, accessible only by rough roads across open prairie. But their story remains etched in the scarred metal of Big Boy 4005. Of the 25 Big Boys built, 4005 is the only one that killed its crew. 8 Big Boys survive today in museums across America. One, number 4014, has been restored to operation by Union Pacific and tours the nation, drawing enormous crowds wherever it appears. These locomotives remain symbols of American engineering achievement, testaments to what steam power could accomplish at its absolute peak. But 4005 stands apart. It is a reminder that even the greatest machines, even the most carefully engineered systems, cannot overcome human error, that switches left open have consequences, that routine runs can end in tragedy, that procedures exist for reasons written in blood. 3 men trusted their locomotive. 3 men trusted the railroad. 3 men trusted that the switches would be right. On April 27, 1953, that trust was broken, and Big Boy 4005 became more than a locomotive. It became a memorial, a warning, a scar on the history of American railroading that will never heal.